Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into something truly mind-blowing. We're going to explore how Muslims, Jews, and Christians separated even though they were basically part of the exact same Abrahamic religion. It's a story of three incredible global movements that literally trace their lineage back to the exact same starting point, yet somehow ended up as highly defined, entirely distinct world religions. We're going to figure out exactly how, and maybe more importantly, when, this massive shift actually happened.
So let's start by challenging a pretty major assumption. If I asked you right now when these three faiths officially split into distinct groups, you'd probably think, well, it happened the second a new prophet showed up, or right when a new holy book was written, right? We kind of have this tendency to view religious history as the series of really sharp, sudden breaks. But when we actually dig into the historical and documentary evidence, a totally different picture emerges. See, the traditional myth imagines a sudden, overnight split, like a lightning strike where people suddenly woke up completely separate from one another, totally distinct Christians or Muslims with zero overlap with Jews. But the historical reality, it was deeply messy. It was actually this incredibly slow, intertwined process of boundary drawing. People lived side by side, sharing practices, sharing beliefs, for decades, sometimes centuries, before any hard lines were permanently drawn. To really grasp this, we literally need to start at the shared roots of Abraham. Because to understand how they separated, we have to recognize how profoundly connected they originally were. Before there was any religious division whatsoever, there was just a single family tree rooted in the patriarch Abraham. Now, historical texts show us how human complexities, jealousies and inheritance struggles between Abraham's wives Sarah and Hagar, eventually led to a physical separation. Sarah and her son Isaac became the lineage for Judaism and eventually Christianity, while Hagar and her son Ishmael became the lineage recognized as the foundation of Islam. But here's the crucial thing. Despite all those early family dramas, that core Abrahamic DNA remained completely shared. And this brings us to a concept that historians call the parting of the ways. Think of this like a branching river. As the historian Shay J. D. Cohen points out, this wasn't a sudden earthquake that just violently cracked the earth in two. It was actually the incredibly slow carving of new theological and social channels over hundreds of years. The key takeaway here? It was a process, not an event.
Okay, so let's see how this played out in the first century, focusing on Christianity's incredibly gradual departure. This is absolutely fascinating. The earliest days of what we now call Christianity looked nothing like a separate religion. The earliest followers were actually Jewish Christians. They were ethnically Jewish, they strictly observed Jewish law, they kept the Sabbath, and they worshipped right alongside other Jews in their local synagogues. They maintained what's called a high Christology, meaning they firmly believed in Jesus' divine nature as the Messiah, but they kept it right alongside their fierce monotheism. They literally did not think they were leaving Judaism. They thought they were fulfilling it. Actually, it took massive, spaced-out historical trauma to physically and theologically pry these communities apart. First, you have the Romans destroying the Second Temple in 70 CE, which obviously sparked intense theological questions. Then, decades later, between 132 and 135 CE, you get the Bar Kokhba revolt, which resulted in devastating, unthinkable losses. These catastrophic events essentially forced Rabbinic Judaism to consolidate its identity just to survive. And surviving meant closing the ranks and defining exactly who was in and who was out. And part of that boundary drawing was the introduction of the Birkat Haminim. This was a late 1st century liturgical curse directed at heretics, which explicitly included sectarians like the early Jewish Christians. It was a real turning point. It basically forced Jewish Christians into an agonizing choice: either abandon your belief in Jesus or leave the synagogue forever. As they left and as more and more non-Jews joined up, the church naturally shifted to become increasingly Gentile, and that's how the split slowly finalized. So let's jump forward a bit to the 7th century, to Islam's early ecumenical movement. Because just like Christianity didn't start as an immediate breakaway, early Islam was incredibly intertwined with the monotheists already living around it. When we dive into the early texts, including the Quran itself, we find that Islam wasn't this strictly closed-off religion from day one. It was actually an open, monotheistic umbrella that recognized the righteous among the peoples of the book, meaning Jews and Christians, as being part of a shared, faithful community. In fact, historically speaking, the early community surrounding the Prophet Muhammad is best understood as a believers' movement, or al-Mu'minun. It was a true big tent identity. You didn't have to strip away your previous identity to join. It actively accommodated sub-identities. So pious Jews and Christians who simply believed in the one God and the last day could be completely part of this movement without having to renounce their own heritage. How amazing is that?
And we actually have hard proof of how this ecumenical vision worked in practice, thanks to the Constitution of Medina.
In the year 622 CE, the Prophet Muhammad moved to the oasis city of Medina and drafted a formal agreement. This document was entirely revolutionary. It established a multi-religious polity that was specifically designed to unite the incredibly diverse, and often warring, tribes of the city into one single cohesive society. The historical records are crystal clear here. Jewish tribes like the Banu Auf, the Banu Najjar, and the Banu al-Harith were explicitly legally designated as being part of the Ummah, which was the single political and religious community, right alongside Muslim emigrants. They shared the financial burdens of war and swore to mutually defend each other. They were all in it together. This kind of inclusivity completely rewrote the rules of Arabian society. Before this, bloodlines and tribal kinship meant literally everything. But this new framework basically said, no, mutual faith, righteous living, and cooperation are more important than traditional bloodlines. It proved that different monotheists, whether Jewish, Christian, or the New Believers, could thrive together under one political and spiritual roof. But as we know, things do eventually change. This brings us to the final crystallization. Just as Christianity eventually separated fully from Judaism, Islam also went through its own period of boundary drawing. But for about a half-century after the Prophet Muhammad, those boundaries stayed remarkably fluid. We're talking about believers, Jews, and Christians sometimes even sharing the exact same prayer spaces. This cooperation was totally driven by their shared reverence for God, and between believers and Christians, an incredibly deep shared respect for Jesus as a prophet, even if they squabbled over his exact divine status. The real turning point didn't arrive until the late 7th and early 8th centuries. The Umayyad dynasty constructed the monumental Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem around 691 CE, and the inscriptions placed on it featured highly specific theological critiques. By explicitly etching into stone that God does not beget, nor is begotten, which is a very direct, public rejection of the Christian Trinity, the leadership began drawing hard, official lines between the faiths. Ultimately, it was this delayed process of boundary maintenance by later leaders that officially closed the ecumenical era. As we move into the 8th century, the specific term Muslims started gaining prominence over that broader, big tent term believers. Suddenly, sub-identities were no longer included in the Ummah. And outside observers noticed too. Christian writers in the region started officially describing Islam as a completely distinct religion with its own uncompromisable theological principles. The irrevocable separation was complete. So whether we're talking about Christianity peeling away from Judaism or Islam defining its borders centuries later, religious separation was always a slow evolutionary process, a true parting of the ways. Which brings us to the big takeaway to wrap up our explainer today. We look at the world right now and we often see these three religions as completely distinct, totally separate, and sometimes even opposing forces. But if Muslims, Jews, and Christians actually share this incredibly messy, deeply interconnected origin story, if they are truly branches of the exact same family tree, how might knowing that change the way we approach their relationships with one another in the modern world? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the facts.